At the heart of the Third Reich existed a world that is almost never spoken of, a territory where the body became property of the state, where desire was monitored, manipulated or destroyed, and where intimacy was weaponized. Between prisoner brothels, controlled reproduction programs, guards who perpetrated daily violence, and high-ranking officials who concealed secret rituals, Nazi sexuality revealed a face darker than the war itself. This is the side they never showed you. Sex slaves and female guards. In many concentration camps, Jewish women were not selected for their nationality or their profession. They were chosen for their bodies. Most were under 20 years old. Some didn't even understand why they were there. In one corner, an SS folder meticulously recorded everything: schedules, shifts, names of authorized prisoners, and the results of medical examinations conducted under cold light. Before each day, the women were forced to undress in front of the guards, who inspected their bodies without respect, without haste, and without allowing any resistance. Every mark, every scar, every sign of exhaustion was examined, as if they were items in a human inventory. It was a personal pleasure in the women's camps, the violence that always took on perverse nuances at the hands of the SS guards, as in Ravensbrück. Inspections were carried out not for hygiene, but for subjugation. A Polish detainee recounted that every morning they were forced to remain naked for long minutes in the cold. The punishment was not only physical, it aimed to shatter each woman's self-perception. Humiliation became a tool of control. This absolute surveillance translated into direct exploitation in the brothels that existed within camps like Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and Dachau. Officially, the regime described them as reward houses for productive prisoners. In reality, they were centers of sexual coercion where women recruited through deception or violence were forced to receive different prisoners in strict shifts. The victims were selected based on their appearance and subjected to medical examinations that sought not health but utility. On one occasion in Mauthausen, a young Czech woman who tried to refuse was beaten unconscious. They took her anyway. There was no choice. These brothels operated under strict rules, time limits, constant surveillance, and pre- and post-visit checks. The men who entered were aware that the woman before them had no freedom whatsoever. The scene was a brutal reminder of who held the power and who had been reduced to mere merchandise. In many cases, the men left more traumatized than satisfied. The experience was designed to shatter any prior notion of intimacy. In the men's camps, sexual violence served a different purpose: to break wills, destroy internal hierarchies, and sow fear. Guards who abused newly arrived young men did so as a public demonstration of dominance. In some barracks, the kapos chose their victims from among the weakest. The camp administration tolerated these practices because they functioned as an informal control mechanism. An act of sexual violence could reshape the dynamics of a barrack faster than 100 threats. The body, transformed into a territory of punishment, replaced any form of written discipline. Prisoners marked with the pink triangle suffered an even more extreme fate. Considered deviant, they were placed in the worst commands and subjected to ritual beatings. One survivor recounted that some guards forced these men to perform tasks naked simply so that other inmates could humiliate them. The aim was not only to punish them for their sexual orientation, it was to make an example of them. For them, sexuality became a preemptive sentence. They lived in isolation, under constant surveillance, and with a level of brutality that surpassed even the camp average. Added to this were the medical experiments, where sexuality was treated as raw material. In Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Natzweiler, SS doctors tested sterilization methods ranging from X-rays to chemical injections. Victims were lined up on gurneys, immobilized with straps, and subjected to procedures without anesthesia. Some women were forced to have sex under surveillance to analyze the rate of disease transmission or their moral resilience. Everything was recorded: temperature, reactions, pain, screams. For the doctors, they were numbers. For the victims, an endless agony. Pregnant women faced an additional hell. In camps like Mauthausen, Dachau, and Stutthof, childbirth was seen as a logistical complication. Some women were forced to continue working in quarries or workshops throughout their pregnancies. Others were forced to have abortions. Newborns, when they survived, were separated from their mothers. A guard at Ravensbrück testified after the war that some babies were drowned in buckets or left to die of starvation. Motherhood under that system was not a bond, it was a crime. It was not only women who suffered the destruction of the sexual or emotional bond. At certain times, the camp administration allowed visits from the wives or girlfriends of German prisoners deemed re-educatable. But these visits took place under such strict surveillance that any intimacy was impossible. A prisoner at Dachau recounted that in the visiting room there were 3 guards per couple, taking notes on their posture, tone of voice, even the position of their hands. The message was clear. Not even the most legitimate relationship escaped absolute control. The collapse of the Reich intensified everything. With the Soviets advancing from the east and the Allies from the west, the camps transformed into spaces where norms, however cruel, disintegrated. Desperate guards abused prisoners during evacuations, especially on the death marches. In those final days, the line between sexual violence, sheer brutality, and chaos became indistinguishable. For those who survived, the last few kilometers west or south were an experience where the body ceased to be even an object. It became mere residue. When the camps were liberated, many survivors remained silent about these events for decades. The sexual violence left invisible scars that didn't easily fit into official war narratives. Some kept quiet out of shame, others because Allied interrogators focused on numbers, structures, and commanders, but not on the devastated intimacy. Only in recent years has this hidden dimension of the concentration camp system begun to be reconstructed, a world where Nazi power used sexuality as an instrument of total control. Within those barbed wire fences, the body was not a symbol of life, but of subjugation. And in that brutal logic, sexuality ceased to be human, becoming just another tool of the regime, as effective as a rifle or a watchtower. There was no desire, affection, or intimacy, only domination. Sex on the front lines, soldiers, prostitutes, and state coercion. On the front lines, sexuality wasn't an escape, it was a controlled territory. As soldiers advanced through devastated villages, frozen trenches, and roads blocked by burning wagons, the military command was preoccupied with something that at first glance seemed minor: how, when, and with whom they had sex. For officers, controlling this aspect was as important as controlling the ammunition supply. The war wasn't fought only with rifles, it was also fought with rules that regulated desire. At the start of the campaign in Poland, German commanders noticed a disturbing phenomenon. In some villages, young soldiers were approaching local women, not always willingly. The Wehrmacht feared that these contacts would lead to disease, pregnancies, scandals, or reprisals. In response, they issued strict orders. Any relationship with the Polish population was undesirable and should be avoided. To enforce this, military police units constantly patrolled neighborhoods where unauthorized sexual activity was suspected. In Warsaw, a Jewish woman recounted after the war that, during the first weeks of the occupation, she witnessed soldiers beating a comrade for speaking to a Polish girl. The punishment was not only physical, the man lost his leave for months and was placed under mandatory medical supervision. The message was clear: any desire to escape the Reich's control was a threat. As the advance westward, the regulatory apparatus became more sophisticated. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, military brothels sprang up, directly supervised by army doctors. One afternoon in 1941 in Lille, a captain noted in his weekly log that visits are proceeding in an orderly fashion and no incidents have occurred. This bureaucratic phrase masked a system where women were examined every 48 hours and soldiers had to present a card with their stamped sexual history. Intimacy had been militarized. On the Eastern Front, control took on a brutal dimension. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, soldiers moved through devastated villages where the population was exhausted and defenseless. Command feared that soldiers would abuse their power indiscriminately, not for humanitarian reasons, but because unregulated sexual contact increased cases of venereal diseases. Officers received weekly reports: the number of infections, punishments for misconduct, and the results of inspections of military brothels. Sexuality was a logistical matter. In Smolensk, a military doctor wrote that the average soldier shows negligence regarding the risk of infection. He proposed increasing the distribution of condoms and harsher punishments for those who visited clandestine brothels. This recommendation led to patrols searching homes, basements, and warehouses looking for women working without authorization. Some were deported, Others were forced to register and undergo examinations. The war had turned many into objects of military administration. In North Africa, the phenomenon took on a different character. German troops encountered the colonial network of French brothels, known as maisons de tolérance, houses of tolerance. There, the Germans adopted a voucher system. Each soldier received a limited number of visits per month. The women were required to keep the vouchers as proof of service and hand them over to the collaborationist French police in exchange for food, soap, or coal. For the soldiers of the Afrika Korps, this was presented as a sanitary way to maintain morale. For the women, it was a means of survival in a desert where no one could escape surveillance. In Italy, after 1943, makeshift brothels sprang up where Italian women, many driven by hunger, worked under German supervision. A young woman from Bologna recounted in 1948 how soldiers forced her to show the results of her medical tests as if they were identity documents. Every encounter was recorded, and any suspicion of illness could lead to internment in isolation barracks. Desire had been transformed into a medical record, but the most extreme case was on the late Eastern Front, where violence spiraled out of control. In 1943 and 1944, with the war entering a desperate phase, commanders received constant reports of abuses committed by exhausted, starving, and psychologically broken soldiers. In some Ukrainian villages, battalion commanders ordered the public hanging of soldiers who had raped local women. Not for moral reasons, the rapes provoked riots and violence among villagers, disrupting supplies. Sexual discipline was enforced like any other military regulation. The system of sexual permits also operated within the Wehrmacht. Some soldiers received fraternization licenses to visit authorized brothels. Those who obeyed orders, kept their uniforms immaculate, or distinguished themselves in combat could receive a special visit to a military brothel as a reward. The opposite was also true. Misconduct meant prohibition. On the front lines, desire functioned as both a motivational and a punishment mechanism. Brothels became tools of moral control, just like a military tribunal or a disciplinary platoon. Meanwhile, behind the lines, health inspection services were conducting mass testing. In Riga, 1942, 1,200 soldiers were registered in a single day. Lines of men waited in makeshift corridors while German doctors took notes. Outside, a soldier wrote in his diary that war smells of disinfectant and metal. That phrase captured the atmosphere. Desire was subjugated to the logic of the factory. The regime also knew that sexuality could break entire units. In Greece, during 1943, cases were documented of soldiers disappearing from night patrols to visit clandestine brothels. The authorities responded with mass raids. Nearly 40 women were arrested in a single night in Athens. Police photographs show rooms full of exhausted women waiting for interrogations that lasted for hours. Some were deported as forced laborers. The Wehrmacht did not tolerate activities outside the official channels. As the Reich began to collapse, sexual control descended into chaos. In Normandy, after the Allied bombing and desperate fighting, the official brothels closed. The women who worked there were forced to evacuate alongside retreating units. Some traveled hidden in military trucks, others walked for miles under enemy fire. In Belgium, one group was abandoned during the retreat and survived for days by eating leftover military chocolate from boxes discarded by the roadside. Feasts, abuses, and secrets of the Nazi elites. One of the most emblematic settings was Karinhal, Hermann Göring's residence. There, ceilings covered in hunting trophies concealed nights where music, toasts, and ostentation mingled in an atmosphere thick with excess. Göring strolled among guests, draped in embroidered robes, offering crystal goblets as a declaration of superiority. Among those present were officers, artists recruited for political expediency, and women selected by assistants who knew exactly what kind of women the host sought. The blend of luxury and brutality defined the atmosphere. Antique sculptures, stolen tapestries, and exotic animals surrounded a table where banquets fit for an emperor were served. At the other end of the power spectrum was Joseph Goebbels, whose style was less princely but just as chaotic. At his villa in Schwanenwerder, he hosted gatherings where the line between political discussion and intimate encounter blurred. Goebbels possessed an almost theatrical flair for managing the atmosphere. Low lighting, carefully arranged guests, conversations that began with film, literature, or propaganda campaigns and soon veered into innuendo and subtle games. Actresses, secretaries, and female associates attended these gatherings with the certainty that a good impression could mean a promotion, a film role, or simply the protection of one of the most powerful men in Germany. What many don't know is that several of these meetings were recorded by the attendees themselves, not as complaints, but as administrative records. Internal files in ministries and private offices contain guest lists, travel routes, extraordinary beverage purchases, and notes on the transportation of female staff from universities, embassies, or cultural institutions. These were documents written in bureaucratic language, but behind each form lay a reality that stood in stark contrast to the austerity the regime demanded of the rest of the country. Within this environment, there were more discreet but equally influential figures. Some regional leaders, the Gauleiters, maintained residences where they hosted celebratory nights after successful rallies. In cities like Nuremberg, Hamburg, and Breslau, entire hotels knew when to prepare for the arrival of delegations that demanded full rooms, abundant food, and absolute privacy. Testimonies from employees of these establishments, collected after the war, describe participants arriving with young women recruited for protocol assistance, a euphemism that masked encounters where consent was at least questionable. The SS, for its part, maintained a very different style. It was not a festive atmosphere, but a ritualized one. In certain country houses run by high-ranking officers, the gatherings included speeches on racial discipline followed by rigidly organized dinners. But even within these formalities, there were moments when the leaders let their guard down. There was heavy alcohol consumption, increasingly risque conversations, and, on occasion, women brought in from Berlin on invitations that combined politics with leisure. The SS tried to portray these events as ceremonies of male camaraderie, but details gathered in subsequent investigations reveal an undercurrent of power dynamics disguised as military honor. One of the most striking episodes occurred during an internal conference in Posen. After lengthy sessions of speeches and planning, some of the attendees were taken at night to a nearby villa for a private meeting. The scene, reconstructed from indirect accounts, describes tables laden with bottles, loud music, and a relaxed atmosphere uncharacteristic of the solemn tone that defined the organization. What was significant was not only the contrast with the rigor they demanded of the rest of Germany, but also the impunity with which they indulged in every excess. That night, several officers who just hours before had spoken of collective morality appeared in photographs informally taken by attendees. Jackets open, drinks in hand, and a clear loss of composure. These images were never circulated during the war, but they were archived in private folders seized after 1945. The most disturbing stories came from the occupation zones. Some high-ranking officers visited officers' residences in Poland, Ukraine, or France where abuse had become part of the military routine. There were houses where courtesy dinners were held for commanders returning from the front, and local women were often forced to serve as entertainment staff at these gatherings. The documents recovered in these territories show patterns of young women being moved to occupied mansions, always under the supervision of security units. Survivors' accounts describe nights when military music mingled with shouts, orders, and an atmosphere of total intimidation. As the conflict dragged on, these gatherings took on a more desperate tone. In the final phase of the war, while German cities burned under bombs, several high-ranking officials hosted lavish banquets that stood in stark contrast to the devastation outside. There are accounts of officers drinking in air raid shelters while civilians lay dying in the streets. In Berlin, during the final months, some leaders continued to hold private dinners with fine china and imported wines, even though the capital was already besieged. The sense of impending doom fueled an almost nihilistic behavior. The closer defeat seemed, the more frenzied these gatherings became. What's revealing about this chapter is that it was never just about debauchery. It was a silent demonstration of absolute power. In every raised glass, every hushed-up abuse, every party that defied the rules they themselves had imposed, was reflected the certainty that they were above it all. The double life of the Nazi elite wasn't a fringe rumor. It was a system sustained by internal bureaucracy, institutional complicity, and terror that prevented anyone from denouncing what they saw. Brothels of the Reich, the hidden face of regulated desire. If there was one area where the Nazi regime manipulated desire on an unprecedented scale, it was in brothels. These weren't makeshift or clandestine spaces. They were state institutions designed to manage soldiers, slave laborers, and prisoners. Desire wasn't left free, it was organized, it was categorized, and above all, it was exploited. In the first weeks of the war, High Command demanded absolute control over soldiers' sexuality. They feared disease, disorder, and a loss of discipline. The result was the expansion of a network of military brothels overseen by doctors, police officers, and bureaucrats. In Warsaw, Krakow, Paris, Oslo, and Vienna, brothels catering to German troops became extensions of the barracks. The door might have had red curtains, but behind it the state was at work. The women who ended up there did so by different paths. Some through direct coercion, others under promises of employment, many simply without alternative. In occupied cities, the regime issued orders forcing local authorities to hand over lists of unemployed women, women with criminal records, or women considered morally suspect. A 17-year-old Polish girl was recruited after the police found her selling cigarettes on the street. She had no proper documentation. That was enough. She signed papers she didn't understand, and days later she was behind a door guarded by a German sergeant, waiting to enter the wartime sexual regime. These military brothels followed a rigid protocol. Soldiers had to register before entering. Each visit was recorded in individual notebooks that doctors reviewed weekly. The women underwent mandatory checkups twice a week. It was a system that left no room for improvisation. Intimacy was recorded just like ammunition or leave permits. Within the concentration camps, the network took on an even more sinister character. Brothels for prisoners, called Sonderbauten, emerged as Himmler's experiment to increase labor productivity. The idea was simple: to reward exemplary workers with regulated sexual access. But in practice, it was an expansion of absolute coercion. At Buchenwald, the brothel operated in a two-story building. A dozen women, recruited mainly from Ravensbrück, lived locked up, their days marked by bells. Between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., selected prisoners entered in an order that the SS monitored without blinking. The session lasted exactly 15 minutes. The woman could not sit or speak except when absolutely necessary. At the end, she had to show her hands, wash, and prepare for the next one. The SS kept track of the time. Desire was timed. Some women arrived at these places after being deliberately chosen for their appearance. One survivor recounted being taken to a room full of officers who silently observed her. After a brief medical examination and an ice-cold bath, she was sent to the building where she would spend the next few months. She never learned who signed the order or why she was chosen. She wasn't a person, she was available unit. The regime also experimented with brothels for forced foreign workers. In France and the Netherlands, brothels were set up to avoid contact with local women. The regime's hypothesis was that controlling sexuality would reduce tensions in occupied regions. But the result was quite different. The women who worked there found themselves trapped in a cycle where military police patrolled outside and army doctors inspected inside. A French woman from Lille described her day as an endless line of uniforms, each one worse than the last. The expansion of the war transformed these brothels into strategic hubs. On the Eastern Front, near Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, brothels were established exclusively for officers with even stricter controls. The women, often Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Russian, underwent medical examinations that included photographic documentation. Everything was recorded. The brothels functioned like offices with beds, files, lists, schedules, supervisors, and iron discipline. The regime also experimented with mobile brothels. In 1942, on the Russian front, SS units tested convoys of recreational services that followed motorized troops. These were trucks adapted with internal compartments. These convoys traveled along icy roads escorted by motorcyclists. The women inside lived locked up for weeks at a time. The cold seeped in through cracks in the metal walls, and the hanging lamps swung with every stop. For soldiers, it was a field resource. For women, a mobile prison. One of the best documented cases occurred in the Lublin region. There, German police officers used an urban brothel to gather information on resistance movements. The women were forced to seduce suspects, record their conversations, and submit written reports. The brothel became an intelligence office. Even the instructions were filed as if they were weather reports. Sexuality had been repurposed as a police tactic. But the most brutal part came when discipline failed. A woman who tried to escape from a military brothel was immediately sent to forced labor or punishment camps. On one occasion in Krakow, a young Hungarian woman tried to escape through a second-story window. The SS caught her half a block away. They beat her in the street, dragged her back to the building, and kept her locked up for days without food or water. When she returned to duty, she couldn't stand. They forced her anyway. No one spoke of it afterward. The regime also intended for these brothels to boost soldier morale. Reports sent by officers to Berlin spoke of stability, discipline, and sanitary control, but they rarely mentioned the psychological effect on the women. Many suffered nervous breakdowns, repeated infections, and deep depression. Some attempted suicide. In Buchenwald, a Czech woman managed to hide a shard of glass and cut her wrists. She survived only because a fellow prisoner discovered her and cried for help. The SS punished both of them. On the Western Front, especially after the Allied landings, the network began to unravel. Authorities destroyed records and moved entire women from one brothel to another to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Some were forced to march alongside retreating units. In Belgium, a group of Polish women was escorted for over 40 kilometers until officers abandoned the convoy on a road. Survivors recounted walking for days without food before encountering American troops. After the war, the brothels of the Reich were largely absent from official accounts. Trials focused on military crimes, deportations, and murders, not on systematic sexual exploitation. Many women were never recognized as victims. In some countries, they even bore the social stigma. Documents, photographs, and testimonies slowly emerged, reconstructing a system that functioned like a perfectly functioning cog within the Nazi machine. They were state-run brothels with official seals, entry logs, internal rules, superiors, and medical supervision. Desire wasn't pleasure or freedom. It was obedience. It was a tool. It was another form of control. The regime controlled every last closed door, and behind each one was a story that no one wanted to tell for years. Homosexuals of the SA. When the regime was still a radical experiment in its formative stages and military discipline was just beginning to cast its shadow, the SA moved through the German streets as a hybrid force, half party, half political gang, half makeshift army. In that lawless territory where violence was commonplace, a paradox emerged that today seems brutal. The explicit, visible, and often celebrated presence of homosexual relationships within an organization that would later fiercely persecute the very men who had forged it through violence. Within the SA, the figure who epitomized this entire contradiction was Ernst Röhm. In the early years, his presence had an almost tribal influence. Röhm was a veteran of the First World War, a born organizer, and someone who never hid his homosexuality. He didn't just hint at it, he flaunted it. His private parties, known in certain Munich circles, involved alcohol, young recruits, and an atmosphere of physical camaraderie that, in any other party structure, would have resulted in immediate expulsions. But Röhm was untouchable. He commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of armed men, and Hitler knew it. In the taverns where the SA recruited its members, the nights often ended in an atmosphere that blended political euphoria, male camaraderie, and barely concealed eroticism. Photographs from the period show sweaty bodies, bare torsos, excessive embraces, and an intimacy that no other European paramilitary force displayed with such abandon. Street violence, fights, vandalism, night marches was combined with an explosive sexual energy fueled by alcohol, spontaneous victories, and a sense of impunity. In Röhm's private meetings, the dynamic became more intense. There were young men seeking rapid advancement who knew that their proximity to him could open doors for them. Some recounted that it was common to see commanders embracing newly recruited officers, and that the line between military camaraderie and intimate bonds was practically non-existent. This generated deep tensions with Heinrich Himmler and the SS, who saw such behavior as an obstacle to imposing the new model of purity they wanted to consolidate. Homosexuality within the SA was not marginal, it was structural. Many mid-ranking officers formed small, close-knit circles where loyalty was forged in both political action and intimacy. For them, male brotherhood held almost ritualistic value, a closed community with its own codes. This blend of militarism and desire acted as emotional cement. On night guard duty, on train journeys, on marches, there was a latent tension. a tacit understanding that would not have been tolerated in any other Nazi organization. The problem began when the SA grew too large. Rome intended to transform it into a parallel army, more powerful than the Reichswehr. Hitler needed to discipline this beast, and Himmler found the perfect weapon, turning Rome's homosexuality and that of many of his officers into a political indictment. It wasn't a moral critique, it was a tool to destroy him. For months, the SS compiled dossiers, gathered testimonies, photographed encounters, and produced reports that precisely described names, places, and relationships. One of the most emblematic cases was that of Edmund Heinz, one of the most feared men in the SA, who met his end in the most humiliating way possible. When the SS stormed the hotel in Bad Vissi, they found him in bed with a young comrade. In a matter of minutes, he went from being an arrogant leader to a half-naked prisoner dragged down a carpeted corridor, while Himmler ordered his execution without trial. Gunshots in the courtyard rang out throughout the night. Propaganda would later portray him as a degenerate, concealing the fact that the regime had known about his private life for years. Another was Karl Ernst, head of the SA in Berlin, who was captured on his honeymoon. The SS stopped the car taking him to southern Germany and separated him from his newlywed wife. During the transfer, they read him an execution order written before his arrest. They knew exactly where he would be and when to arrest him. They shot him on a rural road without witnesses, leaving his body lying near a forest. The official version spoke of conduct contrary to honor, although his homosexuality had been tolerated since the early days of the party. The pervert Willy Schmidt had been protected because he regularly took underage girls to bed. He was caught when a minor scandal broke out at the Tempelhof barracks. Months after the purge, that incident resurfaced as his sentence. Following a night arrest, he was sent to the Columbia House concentration camp, where he received the Pink Triangle. There he was, relegated to the hardest jobs and subjected to constant violence by the guards. He didn't last a year. His death was recorded as collapse due to weakness, although later witnesses spoke of systematic beatings. The most sinister aspect was the propaganda shift. The regime began portraying the SA as a degenerate horde, even though the very leaders who denounced sexual corruption had participated in meetings, parties, and networks of favors within that environment. The official narrative transformed homosexuality within the SA into a threat to the nation, obscuring the fact that for years the party had coexisted with it without any real conflict. The final paradox is revealed in the Gestapo archives. While the regime ferociously persecuted any hint of homosexuality among the civilian population, many internal documents detail that the most numerous cases of relationships between men occurred precisely within the party's own power structures. There were reports on field commanders, SS officers, propaganda members, and even administrative staff at the Ministry of the Interior. None of them were arrested. They were all useful. Homosexuality in the SA was neither an uncomfortable secret nor a fringe deviation. It was a key component of its internal culture: intense camaraderie, emotional loyalty, rituals that blended violence, alcohol, and desire. Only when it ceased to serve the political project did that very characteristic become a death sentence. And what had been tolerated, even celebrated, was transformed into a merciless weapon to justify a bloody purge that redefined the entire power of the Reich. The women of the Reich, sacred mother or object of production. In Nazi Germany, the female body was neither a cultural construct nor a private identity. It was a resource of the state. Every woman lived trapped between two imposed images: the almost religious figure of the mother of the German people and the mechanical shadow of the biological instrument tasked with manufacturing soldiers. This brutal and rarely discussed contrast was at the heart of a policy that intruded on private life with the cold precision of an industrial machine. In the years leading up to the war, propaganda elevated the ideal of the Aryan mother to almost liturgical levels. Grand parades of the National Socialist Women's Party, NS Frauenschaft, featured columns of women holding blonde children, accompanied by solemn music and red flags waving to the rhythm of speeches about sacred duty. In the Nuremberg auditoriums, images of radiant motherhood were projected while party leaders repeated the slogan: "A woman who did not bear children not only failed in her role, but betrayed the nation." Behind the heroic facade lay a harsh political reality. Welfare offices distributed marriage loans, awards based on the number of children, and diplomas adorned with black eagles for the most prolific families. Mothers with 4 children received the bronze medal, those with 8, the gold. But these awards masked a more invasive system. Local supervisors registered every pregnancy, verified household conditions, and monitored the husband's behavior. Motherhood became an administrative file, evaluated with the coldness of state accounting. In the hospitals, the guidelines were explicit. Every racially fit woman had to give birth under the regime's supervision. Doctors, bound by strict protocols, evaluated genealogies, family histories, and physical characteristics. Nurses carried notebooks in which they recorded details that might seem absurd, but which were essential to the Reich's logic. Skull shape, eye color, build, grandparents, medical history, a modern maternity ward on the outside, a racial laboratory on the inside. But while propaganda glorified the eternal mother, many women lived a far more disturbing reality. Those who didn't fit the ideal became inconvenient social outcasts. Single women, Jewish women, Roma women, women with disabilities, or simply women considered undesirable were persecuted, sterilized, or sent to institutions where their bodies ceased to belong to them. The regime spoke of protecting motherhood, but ruthlessly destroyed any form of motherhood that didn't contribute to its statistics. In some towns, local inspectors made surprise visits to check if the suitable women were fulfilling their duty. There are reports from municipal committees where not only a young woman's sexual conduct was discussed, but also her mood, her friendships, and her punctuality in community activities. The female body was monitored even before marriage. In several regions, schools offered courses on biological preparation, where adolescent girls were trained to become future mothers of the Reich. Sex education was not education. It was political instruction on the use of the body as a tool of the state. The most sinister aspect of this policy emerged with the Lebensborn program. While officially presented as a refuge for single mothers of good blood, it actually functioned as a system for recruiting women who could be impregnated by SS officers. In some Lebensborn homes, intimacy became a mere formality. Planned pregnancies, births registered with official stamps, babies distributed according to racial criteria. Behind the white walls and manicured gardens, there was a mechanism designed to produce people as if they were part of an assembly line. In daily life, the pressure was constant. A woman without children had to endure stares, comments, insinuations, and sometimes veiled accusations. During certain public events, local officials reviewed lists of childless households and asked direct, uncomfortable, and invasive questions. The regime had turned the womb into political territory. Each birth was a vote for the future of the Reich. Each absence, a national failing. During the war, the rhetoric became even more aggressive. With thousands of men dying on the Eastern Front, the authorities intensified pressure on women to maintain the population. Posters plastered in markets and train stations read, "Your child is tomorrow's victory." In some factories, supervisors were required to report which female workers were of childbearing age and whether they were in stable relationships. It was a level of control that no modern industrial society had ever exercised before. Women engaged in wartime labor faced a double burden. They had to produce goods to supply the front lines while simultaneously fulfilling the maternal obligations imposed by the regime. Many worked on their feet for 12 hours and then returned to unheated homes carrying young children. Propaganda did not depict these scenes. It showed smiling mothers with headscarves, not exhausted women carrying sacks of coal to keep the stove burning. As the conflict unraveled, politics surrounding the female body took on a more desperate and chaotic tone. In field hospitals, births were attended under bombardment. In evacuated villages, newborns were hidden in cellars as soldiers advanced through the streets. The ideal of the Sacred Mother crashed against the reality of burning cities, hunger, and forced separations. Propaganda continued to speak of the miracle of Aryan motherhood, but women lived in ruins, supporting families devastated by war. For many, the end of the Reich meant the definitive destruction of that imposed image. In the testimonies collected after 1945, a phrase appears repeatedly in different forms. "We were never sacred, we were useful." A few words that summarize the true place the regime had assigned them. Not saints, not untouchable, not venerated, but cogs in a machine that only considered them valuable insofar as they could produce lives for a cause they had never chosen. Goebbels unleashed lust, propaganda, and power. Joseph Goebbels was the architect of the Nazi regime's most powerful lie. He constructed images, molded emotions, and transformed speeches into weapons of mass control. But behind the minister of propaganda hid a man governed by contradictory impulses, political discipline in public, unbridled passion in private. To understand his role, one must descend into that world where power mingled with desire and where every personal relationship could become a political instrument. From the beginning, Goebbels knew how to surround himself with women attracted to his intelligence, his intensity, and his rising position within the party. He possessed magnetism, not physical but emotional. He knew how to read people, manipulate them, and seduce them with words. In the early years of the regime, he already enjoyed a level of fame that allowed him to approach young actresses, journalists, and secretaries. Many of these women came to him seeking opportunities in film and radio. Others were simply drawn in by his ability to create an atmosphere of instant intimacy. His marriage to Magda did not diminish his double life. The couple became an official symbol of the ideal Nazi family. Blonde children, order, domestic harmony. The reality was quite different. Goebbels kept an emotional record of his desires and frustrations in his diary, where he noted every conquest, every fight, and every fantasy. What for others would be a secret life, for him was part of his identity. He hid these pages from the public, but not from himself. In them, one can observe how his vision of power was inextricably linked to his sex life. The propaganda offices became a stage where Goebbels controlled everything: budgets, films, scripts, and also the women who worked closely with him. His influence in the film industry opened doors that he used both to boost careers and to attract lovers. Private auditions, meetings in closed offices, and working lunches were part of a routine that blended artistry and coercion. Many of the actresses who accepted his advances did so knowing that a leading role could depend on his goodwill. Magda was fully aware of this. Arguments in her home could begin as political discussions and end in accusations of infidelity. There were episodes of profound crisis, some so intense that they forced the intervention of the regime's leadership. Hitler, who adored the image of the perfect family that Goebbels projected, detested the idea of marital scandals. He demanded reconciliations, imposed calm, and pressured the couple to stay together, not out of affection, but for propaganda purposes. But Goebbels always returned to the same pattern. His drive was relentless. Among his lovers were well-known women and others who were completely anonymous. Some entered into the relationship hoping for advancement, others out of fear. In the Reich's political climate, rejecting a minister could have serious consequences. He knew this and exploited it, though rarely explicitly. It was enough for his secretary or an actress to grasp the true hierarchy of power. As his influence grew, so did his paranoia. He feared his affairs would fall into the wrong hands, especially Hitler's. Therefore, he began to move with greater caution. He ordered investigations into the private lives of those around him. He demanded reports on rumors, habits, and relationships of others. What he applied externally, surveillance, propaganda, manipulation, he began to apply internally as well. The boundary between his work and his private life was completely erased. When his most dangerous affair erupted, the regime trembled. The young and charismatic actress Lyda Barova became the object of his obsession. Goebbels spent hours writing to her, visiting her secretly, promising her a life together that he could never deliver. The situation reached a breaking point when Magda threatened to leave the minister. For Hitler, this represented a political problem. He ordered Goebbels to end the relationship and Barova to leave Germany. The expulsion was immediate and brutal. The actress vanished from the Reich's artistic scene in a matter of days. That episode marked a turning point. Goebbels understood that his power had limits, but he didn't stop seeking them out. He changed his strategy. He maintained relationships, but with greater discretion. Some mistresses worked in government ministries. Others were minor figures in the film industry. Still others were married women who saw him as a means of social advancement. The network grew silently, sustained by intermediaries who arranged meetings, coordinated schedules, and selected safe locations. Meanwhile, the propaganda machine advanced relentlessly. Goebbels used his understanding of human emotions to direct mass campaigns. He knew how to inspire adoration, how to create fear, and how to manipulate crowds. He displayed that same skill in his private life. His appeal lay not in his physical appearance, but in his ability to make those around him feel indispensable until the exact moment he no longer needed them. Within his inner circle, sexual power was intertwined with politics in an almost ritualistic way. Stories of private parties, secret encounters, and compromising situations were circulated. Some aides tried to use this information to their advantage. Others remained silent out of fear. The official image of a dedicated, hard-working, and disciplined minister was a mask polished by his own department. But the truth was that Goebbels lived in two parallel worlds. In one, the public figure, the orator, the strategist, the manipulator of the masses. In the other, the private man, impulsive, emotional, obsessive, always dissatisfied. This contrast was not accidental. It was part of his character. His private life was not an escape from power. It was an extension of it. Without total control over his relationships, he felt incomplete. Emotional domination fueled his identity as much as his speeches in packed stadiums. In the final years of the regime, tensions intensified. The war, the destruction, and the military defeats did not diminish his drive. On the contrary, they made him more unpredictable. His house became an emotional minefield where Magda, the nannies, and the secretaries moved with extreme caution. Episodes of anger were as frequent as those of euphoria. His diary continued to record everything: the late-night visits, the jealousy, the guilt he never acknowledged publicly. As the Reich began to crumble, Goebbels clung to his family as part of the final image he wished to project. His private life, marked by excess and chaos, suddenly became a tragic spectacle in his final days in Berlin. But this dramatic denouement did not erase what had transpired for years. A minister who weaponized his power with emotion, exploited the desires of others, and used his position to shape entire lives, both in movie theaters and in his private rooms. In him, more than in any other Nazi leader, the blending of sexuality and propaganda was absolute. Goebbels understood better than anyone that controlling the mind of a nation was as important as dominating the private lives of those around him. And, in that explosive combination, he built one of the darkest legacies of the Third Reich. The Führer who could have no desires. At the center of the Nazi universe was a man whose private life seemed devoid of emotion. Hitler constructed a public persona so rigid, so meticulously crafted, that any hint of human desire was transformed into a political risk. His collaborators described him as someone with no visible private life, no discernible personal habits, no clear emotional connection. This absence was not natural. It was a strategic decision. Hitler needed Germany to perceive him as a being beyond all temptation. His daily routine was designed to prevent any intrusion. Most high-ranking officials lived surrounded by secretaries, lovers, or confidants. Hitler, on the other hand, lived within a strictly controlled circle where no one could speak about personal matters without authorization. Meals, always with select guests, followed a rigid protocol. He dominated the conversation. He directed the topics. No one was to ask him about his private life. This tacit mandate became law within the circle of the Berghof and the Chancellery. His relationships with women were forbidden territory, even for those who spent hours with him. Secretaries saw a man who could go days without any physical contact. His habits were strange: long nighttime walks, endless speeches at the dinner table, prolonged silences, sudden mood swings. This reticence was interpreted by many as voluntary, almost monastic abstinence. But in reality, it followed a different logic. To show desire would be to show vulnerability, and Hitler had decided that the Führer could not have any cracks. Eva Braun's role operated within this framework. She was neither a recognized companion nor a visible lover. She was a phantom presence, carefully concealed. She lived nearby, but not with him. Her public appearances were non-existent. When she was with Hitler, it was in intimate spaces where no one could see them together. He was constantly obsessed with avoiding rumors, photographs, or comments that might portray the Führer as an ordinary man. Even in moments of greatest intimacy, Hitler maintained emotional distance. Eva was someone who had to understand her role, to exist without being seen. This invisibility permeated every aspect of their relationship. Nights at the Berghof ended with Hitler retiring to his room alone, while Eva slept in another wing of the residence. Any intimate contact, if it existed, remained strictly beyond the reach of any testimony. To the Nazi circle, she was little more than a shadow. This dynamic not only protected the Führer's public image, it also reinforced his control over Eva, who lived trapped in a constant balancing act between hope, fear, and resignation. Hitler knew that his political role required an extreme degree of theatricality. He presented himself as the son of the people, as a leader dedicated exclusively to Germany. Any visible romantic relationship would have clashed with that image. Propaganda showed him without family, without a partner, without affections. The nation was his only wife. His body belonged to the Reich. That phrase echoed through rallies, newspapers, and pamphlets, constructing the idea of a Führer who had sacrificed all personal desires to dedicate himself to the historical mission he proclaimed. In private, Hitler took refuge in routines that allowed him to maintain that persona. He ate breakfast late, worked at night, watched movies almost every night, and surrounded himself with assistants who treated him with absolute reverence. His life was completely structured so that he would never have to deal with uncomfortable intimacies. Any hint of desire had to be hidden, suppressed, or transformed into an insignificant anecdote for his companions. Emotional control was part of his authority. With the women who surrounded him, secretaries, telephone operators, personal assistants, he maintained a distant but deeply implicit relationship. He never touched them. He never praised them directly. But he fostered an atmosphere where he was the center of their constant attention. The women who worked close to the Führer described a mixture of fascination and fear. Hitler exerted a strange magnetism. He didn't seduce, he commanded. His presence generated a form of emotional submission that he carefully exploited. This dynamic was reflected even in the smallest gestures. Hitler avoided sitting too close to a woman. He didn't allow himself to be seen in casual clothes. He didn't want anyone to witness moments that could be interpreted as relaxed. His public identity had to remain intact at all times, even in rooms with only 5 people. It wasn't just political control, it was a complete denial of human desire as a factor in humanity. The Führer could not be human. Hitler's sexuality unwittingly became a myth within the regime. Goebbels ensured the press never hinted at anything about his private life. Bormann kept a watchful eye on the women in his inner circle, making sure none could cause a scandal. Eva Braun lived trapped within this system of surveillance where every letter, every call, and every outing was monitored. There was no room for error. The Führer's power depended on this silence. The war reinforced this dynamic. As Hitler amassed victories, his image needed to be more rigid than ever. The Polish campaign, the fall of France, and the initial operations against the Soviet Union all contributed to the image of the infallible leader. And the larger the myth, the smaller his private world had to be. During the early years of the war, his personal life was reduced to a handful of rooms, meetings, and meals that were always the same. The women were still there, listening to his monologues and attending his nightly rituals, but never gaining access to his true intimacy. In that climate, any rumor about his desires was considered a threat. The regime's security services received strict orders to investigate other people's conversations, jokes, and innuendos. Speaking about the Führer's sex life could cost you your freedom. Some cases ended in arrests for simple comments made in a tavern. Sexuality was thus transformed into a weapon of the state, something that had to be hidden, punished, or manipulated according to the regime's needs. Hitler maintained this theatricality even as his health began to deteriorate. He trembled, he was in pain, he suffered bouts of extreme exhaustion. But he never allowed anyone to interpret these symptoms as signs of weakness. Around him, the women remained silent spectators of a leader who lived imprisoned by his own image. None could get too close, none could truly know him. Eva reappeared at critical moments for the regime, especially toward the end when the war was already lost. It was then that Hitler allowed her to be by his side more frequently. Not out of love, but because the fall of the Reich had shattered the facade. When propaganda could no longer sustain the image of the invincible Führer, Hitler accepted that her presence was no longer a political threat. In his final days in the bunker, as the outside world crumbled, the emotional distance he had maintained for years became irrelevant. There, in that confined space beneath the Reich Chancellery, their private and public lives merged for the first time. Eva ceased to be a shadow, and Hitler, for the only time, allowed her to exist in plain sight, even though the entire world was already in ruins. It was the ultimate paradox. Only in utter destruction could something resembling a visible bond emerge. The Führer, who had dedicated his life to eliminating desire as a human element, ended up accompanied by the only person who always lived on the border between visibility and oblivion. And that contrast, more than any rumor or myth, reveals the essence of the man, a man who transformed his sexuality into absence, into silence, into a political weapon, into a total negation of himself. Sexuality, power and violence in the concentration prison system. In concentration camps, sexuality ceased to belong to the human being. There it was transformed into a tool of domination, a calculated variable, a mechanism designed to destroy identities until they were reduced to rubble. The guards didn't need to raise their voices. An order, an inspection, a gesture was enough. The prisoners understood that their bodies had ceased to be their own from the very moment they crossed the threshold bearing the iron inscription. For many, forced nudity was the first act of dispossession. There began a process in which the body became territory of power. The selections within the blocks functioned as rituals of control. Prisoners were forced to parade themselves during inspections that lasted for hours. Men and women were forced to stand motionless while guards examined them like merchandise. The slightest deviation in posture could trigger immediate punishment. Sexual violence didn't require physical contact. Constant humiliation was enough to break anyone's will. In that scenario, shame became yet another tool of the regime. In some camps, brothels were established for a specific purpose, to reward the work performance of selected prisoners. There, sex was a form of bribery. Guards chose the female prisoners who would be transferred to work in these places. None could refuse. The women were evaluated based on their physical appearance and their ability to obey without resistance. The conditions were brutal: endless shifts, risk of disease, unwanted pregnancies, and constant surveillance. The regime justified these practices as methods to maintain productivity. Behind this bureaucratic explanation lay the absolute exploitation of the female body. The SS observed that brothels could also serve as a disciplinary tool. Prisoners who failed to meet expectations were excluded, while those who obeyed gained access to these controlled privileges. Desire, reduced to a cog in the camp machine, became part of an equation linking obedience with survival. Intimacy was commodified in a perverse system where consent was non-existent. The female prisoners, subjected to constant surveillance, knew that any complaint could be interpreted as sabotage. Women in concentration camps experienced a different, though equally devastating, form of violence. In camps like Majdanek and Ravensbrück, body searches were used as a method of collective punishment. Female guards wielded a violence that stemmed not only from ideology but also from the absolute power exercised over defenseless people. Humiliation was part of the routine. A simple excuse, a uniform askew, an undone braid, a gesture of weariness, could trigger a session of beatings, forced nudity, or grueling tasks under the sun or snow. Pregnancies within the concentration camp system were also part of this reality. In some cases, pregnant prisoners were forced to perform impossible tasks, often resulting in miscarriages. In others, pregnancy was considered a transgression. Women who became pregnant without authorization, as a result of rape or relationships that arose under inhumane conditions, were punished. Often, children were taken from their mothers to be relocated or eliminated. The camps did not tolerate uncontrolled motherhood. Female sexuality was monitored, suppressed, or exploited according to the needs of the repressive apparatus. Medical experiments took this logic even further. Some prisoners were subjected to mass sterilization trials. Chemical methods, surgery without anesthesia, and radiation were all tested. The goal was to find a quick procedure applicable to entire populations. Bodies became study material. There were no limits. The doctors acted with a level of coldness similar to that of a laboratory technician recording results, while physical and psychological pain ravaged the victims. For the regime, sexuality had no human dimension. It was a variable that could be manipulated, expanded, or destroyed according to the racial plan. In certain camps, sexuality was also used as a form of internal espionage. Some female prisoners were forced to form relationships with specific inmates to obtain information. The regime turned them into cogs in a surveillance network that extended even to the makeshift beds where they tried to sleep. Intimacy was infiltrated with political intent, and any affectionate gesture could be interpreted as collaboration, betrayal, or resistance. In that world, to love was dangerous. Being loved could mean punishment, forced labor, or death. For homosexual prisoners, identified by the pink triangle, the fate was even harsher. Many were subjected to systematic assaults by guards and other inmates incited to attack them. They lived under stricter surveillance than the rest. Any suspicion of unauthorized physical contact could result in public beatings, solitary confinement, or medical experiments. For them, sexuality was a death sentence. Their very existence was seen as a threat to the regime's racial project. Inside the barracks, sexual trauma was a constant presence. Many prisoners never spoke of what had happened. Others spoke only in whispers, fearing that any confession might fall into the wrong ears. Shame, pain, and fear were constant companions to every attempt to survive another day. Among the prisoners, silence was the only possible protection. Sexual violence was not limited to the body. It destroyed identity. It turned men and women into shadows. It robbed them even of the ability to remember who they had been before the camp. The female guards, especially in camps like Majdanek, developed routines where physical humiliation was integrated into daily discipline. It wasn't improvisation, it was part of their training. The young women who entered as auxiliaries learned to wield that power methodically. Sexual violence, direct or indirect, was just another instruction within the system. These weren't uncontrolled individuals, but a perfectly calculated machine. Toward the end of the war, as the camps began to collapse, sexual violence intensified. The loss of institutional control unleashed impulses that had previously been partially regulated. The death marches exposed prisoners to extreme conditions where brutality no longer followed specific orders. In that final chaos, sexuality once again became a weapon. The guards, sensing the regime's collapse, acted with desperation and ferocity. When some camps were liberated, many victims never spoke of what had happened. Their bodies had been battlegrounds where humiliation was relentlessly inflicted. Many survivors found it impossible to explain what they had endured. The accounts that did emerge did so slowly, fragmented and laden with silences. Sexual violence had been an invisible method, undocumented in official statistics, yet omnipresent in every corner of the system. The camps functioned as a laboratory of total dehumanization, where desire was manipulated, repressed, or exploited as part of a strategy of absolute control. That universe didn't arise spontaneously. It was a policy, a planned structure, a machine that transformed sexuality into an instrument, a punishment, and a weapon. And within its walls, intimacy vanished forever. When the lights go out and the images of the Reich fade away, what remains is not the speeches, the uniforms, or the flags devoured by time. What remains is the human trace of a system that weaponized intimacy, turned the body into territory, and made desire forbidden. Behind every opened file, every recovered photograph, the same pattern emerges. Lives shaped, twisted, or destroyed by a state that believed it had the right to decide who could love, who should reproduce, who could sleep with whom, who was useful, and who should disappear. Throughout this journey, we saw hidden parties in guarded mansions, state brothels where life was worth less than a form, women turned into cogs in the machine, soldiers forced to repress their feelings, hierarchs who preached purity while plunging their knights into excess, and SA men who went from celebrated comrades to anonymous corpses for being in the wrong place with the wrong person. In each case, the private sphere ceased to be a refuge. There was no secret that could not be transformed into a tool. There was no bond that could not become suspect. There was no desire that could not be turned into a case file. The intimate became public. The intimate became political. The intimate became deadly.